Hey guys, so we're going to start with chapter 16, or no, not 16, 15 today. And if you remember, what we're looking for is we're looking for shifts in narration, so where it goes from telling the story to giving informational text. There wasn't a lot of, I've read this chapter so far, you might have to wait till the next chapter to find another example. But this chapter is Sharks and Bullets. If you recall from the last chapters, Louie and Phil have been managing to keep themselves sharp. They've been telling stories to keep their mind sharp from not going crazy. Mac has not participated in any of this. Louie has fished. He's caught birds and used the meat to fish. So they've been staying alive on the raft for 3 weeks. Now we're going to start this chapter and see what happens. So they've been on there. Now it says 27 days here so far. On the 27th day, a plane came. It began with a distant rumble and then a spot in the sky. It was a bomber moving briskly west. It was so far away that expending the flares and the dye was questionable, but the men decided to try. So it's so far away that they're like, I don't even know if we should try this, but they do it. Louie fired 2 flares, drawing vivid lines across the sky. He spilled dye into the ocean and then used the mirror to angle light towards the bomber. The men waited, and the plane faded away. As the castaways slumped in disappointment, there was a glimmer on the horizon. The bomber was coming back. Crying with joy, Louie, Phil, and Mac waved and called out. The plane dropped, skimming the water. Louie squinted at the cockpit and he saw 2 silhouettes, a pilot and a co-pilot. Suddenly, the ocean erupted. There was a deafening noise and the rafts began hopping and sputtering. So they hear this deafening noise and the raft that they're in starts hopping and sputtering, which means that bullets are hitting it. The plane's gunners were shooting at them. Louie, Mac, and Phil clawed for the raft walls and threw themselves overboard. What's in the water beside them? Sharks. They swam under the rafts and huddled there, wincing, watching bullets cut bright slits in the water around them. Then the firing stopped. The men resurfaced. The bomber had overshot them, so the bomber shoots at them, and then it goes past them. 2 sharks were nosing around. The men had to get out of the water immediately. Trying to get into Louie and Mac's raft, Phil floundered, so he struggles to get into the raft with them. Louie gave him a push and Phil slopped on board. Mac, too, needed help. Louie dragged himself up and the 3 sat, stunned but uninjured. They couldn't believe that those airmen, mistaking them for Japanese, would strafe unarmed castaways. So they're like, I can't believe that bomber shot at us. Unarmed castaways. Beneath them, the raft felt doughy. What does that mean? Doughy means that it's losing air, so it's kind of sagging in. Squishy. The bullets had struck it and it was leaking air. The bomber turned and flew towards the rafts again. Louie hoped that the crew had realized their mistake and was trying to help. As the plane closed in, The bomber turned and flew towards the rafts again. Louie hoped that the crew had realized their mistake and was returning to help. So all this time, they're thinking it's an American plane. As the plane closed in, its side passed into view. The men, all 3, saw it at once. Behind the plane's wing, painted on the fuselage, was a red circle. The bomber was Japanese. This is a picture of a Japanese bomber, so they see the circle. So as it passes them the second time, they see the circle on the side and know that it's a Japanese bomber. As Louie turned to dive into the water, Phil and Mac didn't move. They were too weak to go back into the ocean. Think about it. Have you ever tried to get, if you're in the pool in the deep end and you're trying to grab a floaty and get on top of it, it's hard So imagine them going for 27 days without much food or water and having no energy whatsoever and having to pull themselves up into a raft where there's no bottom to the ocean. They can't push off of anything to get into the raft. So they didn't move. They were too weak to go back. As the bomber flew towards them, they laid down. Phil put his knees to his chest and covered his head with his hands. Mac pulled himself up beside him. Louis took one last glance at them and then dove under the rafts. The bullets showered the ocean in a glittering downpour. Louis saw them pop through the canvas. So imagine he's under the raft and he's looking up at the top of the raft. And he sees sunlight coming through the holes in the raft where the bullets have gone through. After a few feet, they spent their force and fluttered down, fizzing. Louis pushed against the bottom of the raft, trying to get below the bullet's lethal range. Above, he could see the impressions of Mac and Phil's bodies, and both of them were still. As the bullets raked overhead, the current began dragging Louis away. He knew that if he lost touch with the rafts, then he wouldn't be able to swim hard enough to fight to get against the current to get back. As he was pulled loose, he saw a raft tether and grabbed it and tied it around his waist. As he lay underwater, his legs tugged in front of him, Louis looked at his feet, watching a sock flap in the current. Then, from underneath the murky blur beyond it, he saw the huge, gaping mouth of a shark emerging out of the darkness and rushing straight at his legs. So he's under the raft, he keeps looking up at them, and he looks down underneath him, and a shark comes up from the top, or from the bottom, to go at his legs. Louis recoiled, swinging his legs to the side, but the shark kept coming directly at his head. He remembered the advice of an old man in Honolulu. Make a threatening expression and then stiff-arm the shark's snout. As the shark lunged, Louis bared his teeth, widened his eyes, and rammed his palm into the shark's nose. The shark flinched and circled away, so it flinches, circles away, and then charges back. Louis waited until the shark was inches from him and then struck again. Again, the shark peeled away. Above, the shooting had stopped. Louis pulled himself along the tether and grabbed the raft wall and scrambled aboard. Mac and Phil were still. Bullet holes all around them. Louis looked at Mac. Mac made a sound. Louis asked if he'd been hit. Mac said no. Louis spoke to Phil. Phil said he was okay. The bomber circled back. This is the third time that the bomber has come through, shooting them with bullets. Mac and Phil played dead, and Louis tipped back into the ocean. As the bullets knifed in the water around him, the shark came at him again, and again Louis bumped its snout and repelled it. Then a second shark attacked. Louis hung there, flailing his arms and legs as the shark snapped and the bullets shot past. The moment the bomber sped away, he clambered onto the life raft again. Phil and Mac were still unhit. 4 more times the Japanese strafed them. So the bomber goes by 7 different times. 7 different times. And each time Louis jumps into the water, knocks out sharks, and comes back and finds Phil and Mac miraculously still alive and not hit. Each time he emerged, he was certain that Phil and Mac would be dead. Impossibly, though there were bullet holes around the men, even in the tiny spaces between them, not one bullet had hit either man. The plane returned and Louis dove again. The bomb bay doors dropped and a depth charge, an underwater bomb, rolled out. The men braced for an explosion, but none came. Either the charge was a dud or the bombardier had forgotten to arm it. Louis heaved back onto the raft and collapsed. When the bomber passed again, he was too tired to move. The gunners didn't fire. The bomber flew west and disappeared. Okay, so 7 different times he goes over. Phil's raft was slashed in 2. Remember, they had 2 rafts. The bullets have cut one of them completely in half, so they only have 1 raft left. Shrunken and formless, it lapped on the ocean surface. The men were sardined on Mac and Louie's raft, its canvas speckled with dozens of tiny bullet holes. Both of its air chambers were punctured. So there's all three sitting in this raft, and it's slowly leaking air to where they're not going to be, it's going to sink. Each time someone moved, air sighed out, and the raft sat lower in the water. The sharks whipped around it, wildly excited. So the bomber has left. One of their rafts is gone. And because of all the noise from all the bullets and all the motion in the water, it's riled up the sharks to a very excited state. They also can hear, the sharks can hear the air being released from the rafts, and it's getting them all riled up. As the men sat exhausted and in shock, a shark lunged onto the raft, its mouth open, trying to drag a man off. Someone grabbed an oar and hit it, and then it slid away. Then another shark jumped in, and another. Then 4 men wheeled about, frantically swinging at sharks. As they swung and the sharks flopped up, air was forced out of the bullet holes and the raft sank deeper. Soon the men's legs were underwater. So think about it. They're all swinging at those sharks, and every time that one of them stands up to swing, they push down on the raft and it releases more air. So the more they swing, the faster their raft is going to sink. Crazy. Crazy, crazy, crazy. Let's see. If the men couldn't reinflate the raft immediately, I keep losing my spot. There we go. If the men couldn't reinflate the raft immediately, the sharks would take them. One pump had been lost. Only one remained. The men hooked it to a valve and took turns pumping. Air flowed into the chamber and seeped out through the bullet holes, but if the men pumped very quickly, just enough air passed through the raft to lift it. The sharks kept coming, and the men beat them away. So they've got this air pump, and they're pumping air into the raft, and it's keeping them just above water if they pump really quickly. Louis groped for the patching kit. So if you remember, they had chocolate, water, flares and stuff, and then a patching kit if the raft got any holes in it. Louis groped for the patching kit, and as Phil and Mac pumped and fought sharks, he began the laborious task of gluing patches on the bullet holes. So he's having to move the raft around to fix the bullet holes in the raft. Sharks kept snapping at him. They began stalking about, waiting for a moment when an oar was down or a back was turned before they bullied their way aboard. Over and over they lunged at Louis from behind. Mac and Phil smacked them away. Hour after hour the men worked, clumsy with fatigue. All three were indispensable, so that means that they couldn't have done it with only 2 of them. All 3 of them had a job. Had there only been 2, they couldn't have pumped, patched, and hit sharks. For the first time, Mac was truly helpful. So Louis patches the holes, and there's hundreds of holes. Remember, the plane passed by 7 different times and shot at them 7 different times. So there's tons of bullet holes. So Louis patches, Phil pumps the air into the rafts, and Mac hits the sharks. Night fell. In the dark, patching was impossible, but the pumping couldn't be stopped. They pumped all night long, so drained that their arms went numb. In the morning, the patching resumed. The rate of air loss gradually lessened. Once the top was patched, they had to patch the bottom. All 3 squeezed onto one side of the raft. They deflated the other side, lifted it up, turned it over, and let it dry. Then Louis patched as the other 2 pumped and struck sharks. When the half was patched, they reinflated it, crawled onto the repaired side, deflated the other side, and began again. Finally, they could find no more bullet holes. Because bubbles kept coming up from below, they knew that there were holes that they couldn't reach. They'd have to live with them. The patches had slowed the air loss dramatically. They cut back to pumping once every 15 minutes or so by day, and none at night. With the raft reinflated, the sharks stopped attacking. The crisis was over, Phil and Louie thought about. Once the crisis was over, Phil and Louie thought about the bomber. They thought that it must have come from the Marshall or Gilbert Islands, which were roughly equidistant from them. It had probably been on a sea search and likely took off around 7 a.m., a few hours before it reached the rafts. Estimating the bomber's cruising speed and range, they made a rough calculation to arrive at how many hours the bomber could remain airborne after it left them, and thus how far they were from its base. Crunching these numbers, they guessed that they were about 850 miles from the base. If this was correct, they had crashed about 2,000 miles east of the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, and they had already traveled more than half the distance to them, covering more than 40 miles a day. They'd had no idea that they were so far west. Using these figures, they made an educated guess of when they would reach the islands. Phil guessed the 46th day. Louie guessed the 47th. This would mean surviving on the raft for almost another 3 more weeks. As frightening as it was to imagine what might await them on those islands, it was good to know that land lay somewhere ahead. The bomber had given them something for which to ground their hope, but Mac didn't join in the conversation. He was slipping away. All right, y'all. I will talk to y'all when we start reading chapter 16, and I will talk to y'all later.